Good morning, everybody. This is History in the Modern World. Today, we're going to be talking about Jon Lewis. Jon Lewis is a person who passed away this past week. He was a member of Congress and a leader in the American Civil Rights Movement. So today, I'm going to be going through a little bit of history, American history, and talking about Jon Lewis and his effect on the world that we live in. As always, if you have any questions, you can put those in the Q&A box. But today I will be showing you guys this slideshow and I won't be on camera today. So if anybody is concerned about that, don't worry, it's intentional. But we wanted to talk about Jon Lewis and I wanted to show you some pictures and talk about some events from his life so that we could keep the focus there. Good morning to everybody coming into the class. I see you all, good morning. If you have any questions, you can put them in that Q&A box and I will answer them there. So this is Jon Lewis. He was born in 1940 and he passed away just over a week ago. And he had a big effect on American history. In this class, we like to talk about American history and what it has to do with our lives today. And we thought this was a pretty important topic that we could cover. So in order to talk, though, about the effect that he had on today and how we're living today, I think we need to start with going over some American history, starting with before America was even technically a country. The first people that were enslaved and came to America as slaves arrived on the shores of what is now America in 1619. These were people that had been captured in Africa and taken to the shores of what's called the New World. But this point was in Virginia on the east coast of the United States. But these people were taken from their homes, kidnapped, and then brought to America to be used as unpaid labor. These people would have to work their entire lives for free, and they were not allowed to leave. They were not allowed to make their own decisions about what they were going to do with their lives. The people that had captured them or bought and sold them were going to make all the decisions about how they would work, where they would work, who they could marry, whether they'd be allowed to keep their families with them or not. There has been slavery throughout human history and even today, but this was the first time that enslaved people were brought from Africa to what is now the United States. A lot of slaves were brought to the southern part of the United States, but at first, in what is now America, slaves were actually used all over. People were being made to work mostly for, agriculture on farms, but in all parts of life. Slaves were made to work in factories. They were made to work in people's homes as like servants or maids. This picture is on a plantation, which were very large farms, mostly in the southern part of the United States, where these people were being used for unpaid work. They had to work all day, but they were not given any money. They were treated very poorly, usually, and this was just their lives for generations. The United States became a country in 1776, is when the Declaration of Independence happened. People that lived in what is now America decided that they didn't want to be part of Great Britain anymore. They didn't want to be ruled by Great Britain. And they got together and they started fighting back against Great Britain. And in 1776, they basically signed, or they wrote and then signed a document called the Declaration of Independence. To declare something is to state it firmly. And independence, of course, is being separate or free from something, having your own freedoms, not having to be under the rule of something else or somebody else. So, as you can see in this painting, all of the people that were making this decision were white men. And as you can see, most of them look wealthy. Most of them were, very important, very wealthy people that they wanted to fight for this idea of freedom. But even, back then, their idea of how broadly that freedom would apply is not the same as, what we would think, how broadly we think freedom should apply today. In the Declaration of Independence are written these words: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." So to hold something is to believe it, to think that it's true, to observe it. And self-evident means you don't have to prove something. You don't have to give evidence or convince anybody of it. When something is self-evident, it's supposed to be obvious. It's supposed to be that everybody should be able to see it. So the people that wrote the Declaration of Independence were saying that all men are created equal. And what they mean by that is, whether you believe in a creator, in God, or however you believe that people came to exist on the earth, they were stating that they are all equal. They should all be equal. While they said that in 1776, there were still many, many enslaved people in what is now the United States. So at the same time, they were stating that it's obvious that all people are created equal. There were still many, many people that were not being treated equally. It's a great contradiction of American history that the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence could put this idea out there and acknowledge that all people should be equal, but at the same time, not be able to get rid of slavery at that time. There were many people throughout the country that did not agree with slavery and did not own slaves, and even worked very hard against the laws that allowed slavery. These people were usually called abolitionists. Abolition means to get rid of something. So the people that wanted to fight against and get rid of slavery continued to work before the Declaration of Independence and after, when America was a country. They worked very hard to try to get rid of it. But a lot of people in the United States wanted to hold on to slavery, did not think that it should be gotten rid of. So eventually, the people of the United States had a war that was mainly fought about slavery. There were some other viewpoints and some other issues at stake, but the main issue of the Civil War was whether or not states of the United States could have laws that allowed slavery. President Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and the southern United States were not happy about this. They knew that this was moving the country more and more towards not having slavery. So the southern United States split off and said, we're not going to be part of the United States anymore. And the northern states, led by Abraham Lincoln, said, we're not going to let you separate. And they fought a war over this for 4 years. It was the most destructive, bloody war in American history. More people died in this war than in the rest of the wars that we have been in. Gerard asks, are civil rights like fighting for the rights of African American people? Yes. The term civil rights means the rights that we all have as citizens or people, the rights that we all share. And another viewer asks, why did they say that all men are equal? That is because that was a belief, a viewpoint that they were putting out, that this was sort of a new idea in the world. Well, this idea had been around before, but the people that lived in the colonies in the New World, they were under the rule of a king, and they didn't want to be under the rule of a king anymore. So they were putting this idea out in the world again, that all men are created equal, that they shouldn't be ruled by a king, that all the people should be allowed to have rights. Again, the problem with this is that many people within the United States did not have rights at the time. you'll also notice that they use the word men. Many people later pointed out that they, for example, did not include women in the statement. Some people might argue that when it says all men here, it means all mankind or all people, but women were not allowed to vote at that time, and they were not allowed to have many rights. So this was an idea that was put out there, and it was a very good idea, but it was going to take a lot of work. And it could be argued that the Civil War was part of this work. It was, it was a lot of destruction, a lot of people died, but in the middle of the war, one thing that happened was that Abraham Lincoln made a proclamation. And a proclamation is when you're proclaiming something, which means you're stating something broadly. You're letting everybody know. And what Abraham Lincoln was saying here, this is called the Emancipation Proclamation. And emancipate means to set free. And again, proclaim means to state something broadly. So Abraham Lincoln was stating broadly that all of the people that were enslaved in the southern United States were now free. Anybody that was a slave in any of the states rebelling against the United States would be free. So if they escaped from a southern state, or if a northern army found them and set them free, those people were now free. So this is a milestone. It is one of the major events in American history in the civil rights movement, of that Black people in the southern United States, in the states that were rebelling, if they could get free of the people that were enslaving them, the government was saying, you're free from now on. And that was the first time that they had a chance at freedom broadly. There is a document called the Constitution, which is sort of the rules of how America is supposed to work as a country. You may have heard of the Constitution before. And part of having this document that says how the country is supposed to work is that it can be changed over time. So when it was first written, slavery was legal. It was something that you were allowed to do, to enslave other people. After the North won the Civil War, amendments were passed, and an amendment is a change. So to amend something means to change it. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th times the Constitution was changed or amended were right after the Civil War. And these changes are summarized here. This is not the actual text of what it says, but this is basically what happened. The 13th Amendment said slavery is going to be illegal from now on. The 14th Amendment says that all citizens are supposed to have equal rights, and the states cannot take away these rights without basically letting somebody have a trial. If somebody breaks a law, for example, they can be put in prison, but they have, and that's basically taking away their freedom, but they have to have a trial first. You can't put somebody into prison, or you can't enslave somebody just because you paid somebody else money. You're not supposed to be able to take away somebody's freedom for no reason. Lastly, the 15th Amendment said that all men are allowed to vote no matter their skin color. So again, this didn't address whether or not women could vote, for example, but it was progress. It was moving along toward letting more people have rights and moving toward all people having rights. Now, it's important to recognize that just because something is legal or illegal on paper or in our laws doesn't mean that everybody is going to follow it, or that everybody is really going to kind of go along with what the laws say. After these amendments to the Constitution were passed, many states passed laws of their own saying, basically, fine, African American people won't be enslaved anymore, but we're not going to, we're still not going to treat them all the way equally. These are some signs from various places around the United States where at the time, the term for African American or Black people was they used the term colored. That's now considered offensive. We don't use that word anymore, but at the time, you would see this term all over the place on signs. There would be different bathrooms for white people or Black people. There would be different drinking fountains. This is a sign from a laundry company that's saying we will only wash the clothing of white people. There's a photograph here from a school. Usually, almost everywhere at first, Black people had to go to schools in different schools than white people. You would be separated where you could go to school based on your skin color or what you looked like. And the schools that white people could go to were usually better funded, had better teachers, had more supplies, had more access to a good education than the schools that Black people were able to go to. And there were some people that challenged this. They would try to get these laws changed, and it was very difficult. It took a long time. Some of the main courts of the United States, when these laws were challenged, they said repeatedly, they said, well, people aren't enslaved anymore, and we're just going to keep the people separate. Even when people challenged these laws were upheld. They were kept in place, saying for a long time, the courts of the United States said, yes, it is okay to keep Black and white people separate as long as they are equal. The problem, though, is in a lot of cases when Black and white people were kept separate, they were not equal. It is very difficult to treat people equally when you're keeping them separate, because in many, many cases, the separate facilities for white and Black people were definitely not equal. This came in lots of ways, like in a theater or a movie theater. Black people would have to go in a different entrance and sit way up high while the white people were allowed to sit closer to the stage. On buses, the white people would be allowed to sit up front and the Black people had to sit in the very back of the bus. I think if anybody tries to imagine themselves in that situation, it feels very unfair. And it does not feel like you're being treated like a person or like a human, like everybody else. And it was very frustrating for a long time that while the laws of the country said that people were supposed to be treated equally, that these laws still were basically making it legal to not treat them equally. You can imagine, I mean, it'd be like the rules of your family or your school or anything else. On paper, supposedly you're supposed to be treated equally, but you're actually still being discriminated against. And that means you're still being treated differently or you're being treated worse, not based on anything you personally did, but based on what you look like, what your family looks like, where your family came from. One viewer asks what all the rest of the amendments are, because we just talked about the 13th, 14th, and 15th. That is a big topic. There are many amendments to the Constitution. That means there's many big changes, and that's a very interesting topic to research, but it's a little bit bigger than we have time for today. But many of the amendments to the Constitution have to do with the rights that people have. The first 10 amendments, we call them the Bill of Rights. It's basically a list of rights that you have or you're supposed to have in America. These amendments came later on, but again, they were talking about the rights that Americans are supposed to have. Another viewer asks, did the Black people have lawyers? Yes, in many cases, they would get lawyers. They would work together to hire a lawyer to represent them. But it was very difficult. The country was being run by white people in the government that did not always want Black people to be treated equally. And in many cases, even when they said these laws are not fair, or these laws are not following what the Constitution, the guiding rules of the country, they say these rules are not following what it's saying. In many cases, even when they had very good lawyers, they would lose their cases because the people in power did not want things to change. So this was going on for a very long time. And it was still going on all the way in 1940 when Jon Lewis was born. So Jon Lewis was born in a town right outside of a town called Troy in Alabama. You can see that this is in the southern part of the United States. It was a very rural, like out in the country area. Jon Lewis's family were sharecroppers, and a sharecropper is a person who works on the farm of somebody else. Jon Lewis was the third of 10 children. He had a big family, and his parents worked hard. This is not a picture of his family, but this is a picture of sharecroppers. They basically worked very hard, and they did not usually make very much money for their hard work. Because again, in the southern United States, there were a lot of laws and rules in place that were basically designed to make it very hard for Black people to get ahead. They were designed to make it very hard for them to have the freedoms that the Constitution and other laws said that they should have. So it was sort of like, the rules were rigged against them. It was made to keep the African-American people poor and not doing well, even though the Constitution and the amendment said these people are free. It was sort of like the laws were designed to try to keep them as close to being in slavery as possible. And again, this lasted for a long, long time. And even when Jon Lewis was born in 1940, a lot of these rules were still in place. So Jon Lewis, as a young man, he was a bright young man. He grew up, he was part of the Christian religion, and he has said in interviews that the first thing he remembers wanting to do when he was a young man was to grow up to be a preacher. He would talk about how on the farm where he lived, he would often practice preaching to the chickens on the farm. Even when he was much, much older as an adult, he still kept lots of little statues and things of chickens around, and he would tell this story to visitors. But he practiced his ability to speak in public by talking to the animals on his farm. As a young man, Jon Lewis would listen to Martin Luther King Jr. on the radio. If you've studied American history, or if you've studied the civil rights movement at all, you may have a good idea of who Martin Luther King Jr. is, because he's probably the most famous person who worked in the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was a preacher himself, but he worked very hard at trying to get equality and true freedom for African American people. He would talk on the radio a lot, because this was in a time period before television was invented and broadly available. But Jon Lewis would listen to Martin Luther King Jr. Speak. And in an interview about 15 years ago, Jon Lewis was being asked about his childhood and growing up. And here's a quote from him. He said, "When I was growing up, my mother, my father, my grandparents, my great-grandparents told us when we asked about segregation, that means the keeping of Black and white people separate, and racial discrimination, don't get in trouble, don't get in the way. But Dr. King, Rosa Parks, and so many others gave us examples like getting in the way. And that's why I was inspired to meet Rosa Parks at the age of 17 in 1957. And he goes on to talk about meeting Martin Luther King Jr. too. So Jon Lewis's family told him to stay safe, to stay out of trouble, stay out of the way. Don't do anything that would get the police or the government mad at you. But listening to Martin Luther King Jr. on the radio and listening to others, these people were saying, sometimes you need to get in trouble. Sometimes you need to put yourself in harm's way to fight back and try to change things that are not right. And something that Martin Luther King Jr. promoted was fighting back in a peaceful way. He didn't want Black people to fight back with violence. He wanted them to do things to change the rules and change the laws without hurting anybody, without physically fighting, without killing anybody. There were various viewpoints on the best way to change discrimination, to change all the unjust laws, but Jon Lewis was inspired by this approach, by this viewpoint. He, as a young person, he also followed very closely the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, again, we mentioned earlier how one of the laws that was very widespread was that only white people were allowed to sit in the front of buses and Black people were required to sit in the back. It was embarrassing. It did not treat Black Americans like they were equal, full citizens. And one way that people in the civil rights movement decided to fight this was to intentionally start breaking the rules. The idea is that, usually most people agree that, we should follow the law, that we should follow the rules. But when those rules or those laws are unjust and they take away your human rights, your civil rights, the viewpoint is that you have a responsibility to break those rules and to try to change them. So Rosa Parks was a person, she was an African-American woman who lived in the South, and she, working together with some other civil rights leaders, decided that she would intentionally break this law. She sat in the front of this bus in Montgomery, which is a town in Alabama. And when she was asked to get up and to move back, which that was what the law said, that's what the rule said, that if a white person wants your seat or the bus driver tells you to get up, that they had to get up. But Rosa Parks did not get up, and she got arrested for sitting in the front of a bus and not moving when she was told to. And Rosa Parks did this on purpose. This was a strategy that in the South, Black people were organizing, deciding that we are going to break these laws and we are not going to fight back with physical violence when we get arrested. We will break the laws as many times as we need to, and we will get arrested as many times as we need to, and we will keep on showing how unjust this is until we can get this changed. This also led to the African-American people that lived in Montgomery decided that they wouldn't ride the buses anymore while these laws were in place. And the bus companies that lost a lot of their riders felt a lot of pressure when, they are businesses, they are companies, and when a lot of their riders are saying, we're not going to use this service until you change these rules, they felt the pressure. The Montgomery bus boycott went on for a long time. So Jon Lewis was following this closely. He felt very inspired by this. He ended up attending Fisk University in Nashville, and this was a university that a lot of other African-American people attended. He met a lot of other people who were also inspired, a lot of other young people that were very energetic about wanting to fight back, like wanting to change these rules. Because when you're one person trying to change an unjust rule, it's a lot tougher than if you can find other people to work together. So Jon Lewis led some groups. He helped kind of found and lead some groups that would organize to break the bad rules and to fight against the unjust laws. One of them was that lunch counters in restaurants could say that only white people were allowed to eat at them. So one of the ways that people, that African-American people would fight back is by going in and sitting at a lunch counter. That's basically, this is like a restaurant. And you sit up at the counter here and you order food. And these are, there's an African-American young woman here who's sitting at the counter, and there's a whole mob of people behind her, white people they're pouring things on their heads. They're dumping salt, they're dumping drinks. They are harassing these people. And it took an amazing amount of courage to sit there and take this abuse and take this harassment and take these attacks and not to fight back. The people here in this picture, they are mocking them. You can imagine they are probably saying really nasty things. And the people sitting here at the counter getting things dumped on them, they were just going to sit there until they got arrested or were hauled away, basically. And that happened many, many times. Many people would do this. This is called a sit-in. They're not fighting, they're not hurting anybody, they're just sitting there at the counter. Jon Lewis here is in the light colored suit in the middle of the screen. This is Jon Lewis and several other students getting arrested for doing a sit-in. They were not allowed to be in, this is like a restaurant or a store here. They're not allowed to be there. They were told that no blacks are allowed here, but they did it anyway. And they stayed there until the police came and arrested them. And again, they did this on purpose. They're saying this law is not okay, so we're gonna break the law until the law gets changed. And this is Jon Lewis here on the right side here. He's giving an interview to a reporter who came to ask him about, why he'd been arrested, what he was doing. And Jon Lewis here with these other students is trying to explain why they're doing this, why they're breaking the law, why they're getting arrested, and what they hope to change. Jon Lewis is in the middle of this picture. Again, he's wearing a light colored suit here in the middle of the screen. This is Jon Lewis and a lot of other students that they are now in court. Jon Lewis got arrested dozens of times. This is just one of the many times. But they would go to court, they would listen, they would, they would basically state that they were doing the sit-in, they were where the law said they couldn't be, but they were basically making the argument that these, laws are unjust. And they would usually accept whatever, punishment the court gave out. It was often fines. They would have to pay money for breaking the law, but they would do this over and over again. Later on, Jon Lewis helped organize the Freedom Rides. This was breaking another rule. And this was that, again, black and white people were supposed to be kept separate or segregated on buses. And Jon Lewis was one of the first 13 people to do a freedom ride, which was where intentionally black and white people that were organizing together would get on buses and they would go on bus trips through the South where these laws were. And honestly, reading about what the Freedom Riders went through is terrifying. Wherever they went in the South, they were met with violence. They were met with organized people fighting back against them, with violence. While the Freedom Riders were being nonviolent, they would meet mobs of white people in the South that would slash the tires of their buses. Sometimes they would throw bombs or things onto the buses to try to kill them. And even people in the government at the time were asking them to stop doing these freedom rides. They said, it's too dangerous, it's getting too violent, you need to stop. And Jon Lewis and others did not stop. They kept on going even after they would get attacked, they would get hurt. they said they are going to keep on going. This is a picture of Jon Lewis up in the upper left-hand corner. This is a mugshot. This is a group of white and black people that were all freedom riders together. Their crime was getting on a bus and traveling in mixed company on a bus through the South. And these photos were taken in Jackson, Mississippi, another heavily segregated area. And again, it took a lot of courage. When the buses would be stopped, often the people would be pulled off the bus and they would be beaten very severely. There are photos of the freedom riders that, you can see their injuries, and it's pretty bad, but they were just going to keep on going. They knew they had a big goal. They wanted to change the laws permanently, and they wanted to get freedom for all people. So they were not going to stop, even when met with violence. So again, as we mentioned earlier, when I read that part of that interview, Jon Lewis met Martin Luther King Jr. He met Rosa Parks. He was a young man, but he was very intelligent and he worked very hard. And other civil rights leaders could see how much passion he had for changing things. Even as a young man, as a college student, he was organizing others. He was already bringing change. So Jon Lewis was one of the 6 people who kind of helped organize and was able to speak at a famous event called the March on Washington. If you've studied American history or the civil rights movement, you may have read about this or may have seen these pictures before. But they called it the Million Man March, and they wanted 1 million people to come to Washington, D.C. and show the world how many people wanted to change things, wanted to bring about change. This is where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. It is one of the best and most famous speeches in American history. It is inspiring. It's where Martin Luther King Jr. talks about his dream of his children growing up to live in a free country where they will be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. Martin Luther King Jr., again, is probably the most famous figure of the civil rights movement. So it's not as well known that there were other speakers that day. And Jon Lewis, as a young man, was actually one of them. This is a picture of Jon Lewis speaking that day. So he was part of the civil rights movement from a very early age, and he worked very hard to change things. He was part of he organized and helped lead a march. This was a large group of people that were going to march from one town in Alabama to another. And here they are marching over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Now, all the people marching here, they are not armed. They don't have any weapons. They are not being violent. They're being peaceful. And they were marching over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Edmund Pettus was a Confederate general. He was a general on the southern side in the Civil War. That after the Civil War, he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, which was a group that basically committed terrorism against Black people. The Ku Klux Klan would terrorize Black people and killed many Black people, and was working very hard to take away the rights of Black people. So the fact that this bridge was named after this person, it was very symbolic that they were marching over this bridge. This large group of peaceful protesters was marching across this bridge. They were trying to bring attention to these unjust laws and that the fact that they needed to change. When they crossed this bridge, they were met by the police, and the police told them to stop marching and to leave. And the marchers refused, and the police attacked them and beat them and injured a lot of people, even though these marchers were being peaceful. This event among others, brought a lot of national attention to the civil rights movement. People saw the pictures of this, and a lot of people who maybe weren't paying attention before started paying more attention. They saw how unfair it was and how unacceptable it was for these peaceful marchers to be attacked and injured. Later on, Jon Lewis, kind of leading from this, got more and more involved in politics and eventually was elected to be a congressman, one of the people that makes the laws of the United States. He was very popular and he was very respected among the people that voted for him and even among the other people in Congress. So he was elected repeatedly many times. This is a picture of Jon Lewis, a much more modern picture, but he was able to work in Congress for a very long time because the people that voted for him, they respected him and they trusted him, and they felt that he worked hard for them. Over the years, they kept on fighting. There were more laws passed that started granting freedom, like real freedom, to all people. Laws that made it so that the rights of Black people to vote would not be stopped. And in 2008, it was pretty historic that the first African-American president was elected, President Obama. And during President Obama's presidency, they walked over on the 50th anniversary of that march over the bridge. They crossed the bridge again. This is Jon Lewis holding hands with President Obama and the First Lady. And it was a pretty different scene. There are other civil rights leaders here. Another former president is here. But to march over the bridge again, everyone was able to see, how far we had come as a country. And that's not to say that the work is done. Jon Lewis and others would, frequently say that this was forward progress, but there's still a lot of work to do. A few years ago, Jon Lewis said this quote. He said, "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble." So this is in memory of Jon Lewis, who passed away a little bit over a week ago. Thank you all for watching today. Thank you for participating and your questions, and have a good day.